All right? Okay. With that said, today's presentation will be the last of this semester, and we will again start up next semester with continuing on to finish World War I, and then we will get into World War II. So this is actually part one of a two-part series for me. And today we are going to talk about naval battles in World War I and how some of the technology changed significantly from the Second Industrial Revolution into these battles. And I refer to this class as Castles of Steel, and that is a famous quote by Winston Churchill. He was indeed First Lord of the Admiralty at the beginning of this war, World War I. And he referred to the British dreadnoughts as castles of steel, and indeed that's what they were. So, well, we've talked about naval warfare numerous times and range of gunnery numerous times, and as we can see here, everything at that point was basically in visual range. So when I fired a gun, it had to be on a flat trajectory on a ship. It needs to be a range that I could see. Now, previous to this, around 1800, we would see that naval warfare, ships would open fire as close as 20, 50 yards. Even in the American Civil War, the battle between the Virginia and the Monitor was probably only fought primarily at about 100-yard range. So indeed, the range was extremely short for these types of battles. But what's going to happen is the guns are now going to improve immensely. And with these guns starting to improve immensely now, you can fire much, much further. What the problem is, though, is trying to hit something much, much further. So around 1901, Admiral Fisher, who we will talk about significantly in this class, he is in charge of the Mediterranean fleet. And what they've decided is that there's a huge problem now because they can't really hit anything much further than about 2,000 yards tops. And torpedoes now are starting to be able to have much more range. So how do you stop ships from launching torpedoes if indeed your gun, you can't hit anything that far out? So they really start to try to work on increasing the ability to use the firepower they actually have. The guns can shoot for miles, but you can't hit anything with them unless they're really close. So they have this guy, and he's Admiral Percy Scott. He is actually not an admiral at this time. He is a captain serving under Fisher in the Mediterranean. And they begin to work out a method where they will be able to hit targets at a much greater range. So if we think about hitting things on the ocean, first of all, I'm in a ship. The ship is moving. The ship is rocking. Okay, I'm going to try to fire my guns at an enemy ship. The enemy ship is moving. I need to know how fast it's moving. I need to know how far away it is. I need all this information, and all this information is being created manually. So it's all being done by hand calculation to figure out where these shells are going to land when the ship that's moving is in that position. That's a lot of math going on there. So Percy Scott says, you know, what would be really helpful, instead of having the guns of each turret, for example, firing separately, it would be much better if we had all the guns firing at, because what they would do is they would aim each turret individually. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. Well, if we had a director way up high in the ship that was communicating to those turrets to have them all fire at one spot, we could then move that fire into a position where you could actually hit something with it. So that's a critical change. So he becomes the father of what's known as directed fire. So now all the turrets are going to respond to a central command, and they're all going to shoot their guns at a certain spot. Okay. Percy Scott, though, as an individual, is a bit of a problem. He is a womanizer, he is a drinker, and he is very, very critical of the British Navy. And many people in the British Navy want to get rid of Percy Scott. And they go to Fisher, who's his boss, and say, hey, you know, you got to get rid of this guy because he's a problem, right? Because he's, you know, he's drinking and he's chasing women and he's really being just critical of everybody. And Fisher says, well, you know, I don't really care if he's a womanizer. I don't really care if he drinks because he hits the target. And under his time, even using all this manual equipment, they are able to increase the range of a decent percentage of hits, almost to 5,000 yards. So indeed, this starts to become very successful. Well, there's a few technical things that come about in the second industrial revolution. One of those, of course, is telescopic sights. So now we have sights we can see better at a much larger distance. The other thing is going to be a thing known as a rangefinder. And I've pictured here a rangefinder, a hand-operated one, just because it's easier to see what you're looking at here. And if you look at the two circles, there is going to be basically a telescopic lens on one side, a telescopic lens on the other side. What you do is you take the distance between those 2 points to where your target is, and that will give you a rough idea of your range. There's several types of these. They work basically the same. There's the coincidence rangefinder, which is preferred by the British. There is the stereoscopic rangefinder that is preferred by the United States and the Germans. And they really work pretty much the same. They both have the same principle of a telescopic sight at each end. Perhaps if you go to see the battleship Alabama, and you crawl inside the turret, you can see this huge tube inside the battleship Alabama. And if you look closely right at the middle of this tube, there looks like there's a pair of binoculars. So that is a stereoscopic rangefinder that is in the middle of that turret at the battleship Alabama. So if we look at the lower picture, we can see this 5-inch turret from a Fletcher-class destroyer in World War II, and those two hatches are a rangefinder inside that turret. So the reason those are in a World War II ship is if that one that's high up on the ship is destroyed or damaged by enemy fire, they can still use the rangefinders within each individual turret. Yes, Judy?
Does the stereoscope, is it like make it 3D? Like a stereoscope?
The question is a stereoscopic rangefinder make it 3D like a stereoscope does? And the answer is no. The difference really is for the stereoscopic rangefinders, you're using 2 eyes. With the coincidence rangefinder, you're only using 1 eye. So basically, it doesn't look like a pair of binoculars with a coincidence model. But it's a reasonable assumption, but no, it doesn't make it look 3D. So anyway, in the Battle of Jutland, for example, the British, and these rangefinders are pretty much equally effective. But what changes at the Battle of Jutland is that the German rangefinders use Zeiss optics. And the Zeiss lenses are superior to the British lenses. So indeed, at the Battle of Jutland and during World War I, the German rangefinders are superior, not because of particularly design, just because they're made with better materials. Well, if you're looking at dreadnought battleships, for example, and you're starting to use this directed fire, the goal here is to see where shells are landing. So if you can see where your shells are landing, you can begin to correct your fire to make it to get hits on that ship. So, and if you have multiple ships firing at the same target, for example, how would you differentiate between those two those splashes? So I mean, if I'm firing, let's say the Seydlitz is firing at Indefatigable and the Lutzow is firing at Indefatigable, how do they tell the difference between those shells? And what they would use is dye markers. So perhaps Seydlitz would be using red dye markers. So when the shell hits the water, it makes a big red splash. The Lutzow might be using green. So when that shell hits the water, it makes a green splash. And so that way they could tell who was who firing at a certain ship. And that makes things much, much easier. Another thing, of course, is if the gunfire is basically the same caliber. And that, of course, eventually will lead to the dreadnought-type battleship. Well, all those calculations were manual. So that's very difficult. It's hard, especially in battle, to try to do all these calculations to try to make hits. Well, so a gentleman named Arthur Poland in 1900 happens to be out at Malta, and he is invited to witness a firing of target practice by the British Navy. Well, he is appalled by the lack of ability for them to hit a target only a mile away. And another person happens to be in attendance, and that's Lord Kelvin. And you may be familiar with him for thermodynamics, for example. He's a mathematician, a famous scientist, and basically leads to one of the fathers of physics. So Lord Kelvin is there, and Lord Kelvin says, you know, I bet it would be a really good idea if we came up with an analog machine that would make these calculations and make this a lot easier to get hits. And Poland says to himself, you know, that's a damn good idea. I think this is a great thought process. And Poland creates a company called Argo. And the Argo company is basically built just to make what will be known as the Argo clock, or in other words, an electrically operated analog computer. And so Argo will make the first one of these. He has another good idea, though, too. Poland decides, well, you know, the ship's rocking and moving, and we need to know exactly where the ship is when we fire guns. And he decides that he is going to include a gyroscope. Now, it's a primitive gyroscope, but he has that idea. So his Argo clock is going to have a couple of big features. It's going to make this data usable and quickly, and it's going to also include a gyroscope. So, in 1906, he is ready to present this thing to the British Admiralty, and he is demonstrating his Argo clock. And there's this other guy there, a Lieutenant Frederick Dreyer. And Frederick Dreyer is a gunnery officer, a guy that's kind of on the rise. And Dreyer sees, and he's actually worked with a little bit with Poland, and he sees this thing and he goes, you know, I can make one of these too. And indeed, he decides to make what is known as the Dreyer Table Mark III. And this will be actually the first analog computer used on a naval ship to control gunfire. Well, later on a little bit, he is put in charge of purchasing these things. And it's amazing that he decides that, you know, I think we should purchase my version of this rather than Poland's version. Well, you know, what happens next is they have adopted this thing, and many people feel perhaps that there's certain aspects of the Dreyer model that are incredibly similar to the Poland version of the Argo clock. And other piece is that perhaps the Argo clock actually worked a little better. But they decided not to buy it. So in 1926, oh, by the way, did I mention Poland sued? I didn't mention that. So Poland sues the British government and says, you know, I think this guy kind of ripped me off, and by the way, my version works better. And so indeed, they pay him 30,000 pounds in 1926. So you can see that there's a little bit of an issue here. And many people, I'm not so sure if I agree with this 100%, but many people feel that indeed the Argo clock was superior, and they would have had much better results at the Battle of Jutland and the Battle of Gallipoli had they used the Argo clock instead of the Dreyer table. But one of those things that people sue over. Well, so the range of artillery now is going way up because, again, the guns can just shoot so much further, so we can now take advantage of this. So, for example, in the 1890s, you can see the range would be 500, would be close. 1,500 would be a reasonable distance to get a hit, and maybe you could get a hit at 3,000. By World War I, we see because of these inventions and this new technology, close range is now 5,000 yards. Middle range would be 8,000 yards, and you can even make hits at 15,000 yards, which is about 8.5 miles. So you can see that the ability to hit targets, a moving target on the ocean, has gone up incredibly. Well, how much does this improve in World War II? Using even better technology. And we can see that the longest hit ever recorded, about a tie, is by the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst. I'm always loath to call it a battlecruiser, but we will. It's more like a little baby battleship. But anyway, it hits the British aircraft carrier Glorious at a range of 26,000 yards. The British battleship, dreadnought battleship, Warspite, manages also to hit the Italian battleship Giulio Caesar at a range of 26,000 yards. And that is a range of about 15 miles. So in order to hit a moving target while you're moving 15 miles away, we can see that the amount of technology involved in firing artillery shells has gone basically an amazing amount in a very short time. Now, I decided to use this picture here of this little guy here I happen to be very familiar with in front of two British 15-inch Mark I guns. And these are the same guns that were used on the Warspite. It's a very successful design. You can see that that is an extremely large cannon. And it fires a shell that weighs 1,930 pounds out to a range of about 30,000 yards. Again, nothing has ever been hit at 30,000 yards, but still it's capable of doing that. So you can see an idea of how large by World War I guns had become. And this gun actually soldiers on, sailors on, I guess, well into World War II. In fact, the last British battleship ever made, the Vanguard, which is not officially accepted until 1946, so after World War II is over, was armed with this very same gun. So it's extremely successful. Yes, Alan?
Where's the 15 inches calculated?
I'm sorry?
Where's the 15 inches calculated?
The diameter of the bore.
But at what point?
Out the muzzle.
At the very end?
Well, it still has to fit into the breech. The breech is a little larger, but the shell still goes into a 15-inch slot. So that's how they figured that out. But again, it fires a really large shell. The way that shell weighs as much as a small car. So pretty potent weapon, really. Well, the idea,
Frank,
yes.
how would they manufacture those barrels? Were they bored or were they cast?
I will send you a video, and you can watch the entire process.
Okay.
I just happen to have one.
Why am I not surprised?
Oh, well, you know. I forgot to send you the one with the Holt, not the Holt tractor, but the Lombard steam hauler. Somebody actually has one of those running, and I have a video of that. I will send that to you as well. But yes, I will send you the manufacturer of this type of artillery. Anyway, 1903, Vittorio Coniberti, the very famous Italian, I'm sure you're all familiar with him, Italian naval designer, has proposed that what the ideal battleship will be in the future needs to be a battleship that fires one single large caliber gun. And this, of course, will lead to the dreadnought type battleship. Why do we want one large caliber gun? Because of the splashes. They can see where the splashes are if they have one type of gun firing. This is a huge advantage. Previous to this, what will be known as pre-dreadnoughts had perhaps 4 12-inch guns, then they'd have maybe 8 or 10 10-inch guns, and then they'd have some 6-inch guns. And so they had all these multiple calibers. And the idea was to sail, and again, it can't hit anything far away, to sail in close and just deluge the enemy with shell fire. Well, as ranges become greater, the idea now is that we're not going to do that. We're going to need to be able to see a single caliber shot, and so we know where those shells are landing, and then we can adjust our fire much more effectively. Of course, this is going to cause a major upheaval in naval power because all battleships are going to become obsolete. So the United States starts planning to build this. The Japanese start planning to build this, and the British, you know, they could see the handwriting on the wall. I had Fisher here, and he says, you know, we better do something really quick here. And so he decides that he's going to build a dreadnought battleship. And indeed, the German Navy is also involved with this as well, and so they are going to cause a huge naval arms race. But this guy's a pretty interesting character. He personally, basically, I told you about him working with the other guy, I can't remember his name now. Anyway, he's been working with these people to modernize the British Navy. And he's really sees that the British Navy is composed of many old ships, and these need to go bye-bye because they're useless. And he makes this comment, these old ships, speaking about the British Navy, would be lapped up by a modern cruiser like an armadillo at an anthill. So he's really deciding that, you know, they really need to totally modernize the British Navy. The other piece is, of course, he's interested in new technologies, particularly submarines and torpedoes. So he's pretty advanced for, he does some strange things, but he's still pretty on top of stuff, pretty much a genius. Well, the HMS Dreadnought will lend its name to an entire class of ships. So we will not refer to it going forward as a battleship at this time. You will refer to it as a dreadnought. And so, of course, she makes everything else obsolete, and so then we refer to those as pre-dreadnoughts. So it's really amazing technology, but again, it causes this giant arms race. And it's such a huge arms race that many people feel, including Massey, if you look at the book Dreadnought by that title, feels that this is one of the particular reasons for the cause of World War I. The fact that there was a huge arms race between Germany and Great Britain. Well, of course, the range is increased. We know that. We know about the shell splashes. But there's another factor with this. The Dreadnought is the largest battleship in the world. She is also the fastest battleship in the world because she is now going to be using steam turbines instead of triple expansion steam engines. That causes another advantage for this ship, though. Because of the fact that you're using a turbine which lays down into the hull rather than a triple expansion engine, you can make an armored citadel that's much stronger and smaller. So if we get that, so basically instead of this big, tall, reciprocating steam engine, which is actually much less efficient, we now have this thing laying horizontal in the hull, and it's giving me more power, more fuel efficiency, and since it's lower, I can make an armored box around it much easier. Well, that causes, again, the need for these really large guns, because now you're going to need really large guns to crack that battleship open to get to its innards. So indeed, the Dreadnought really changes things on multiple levels. It's huge, it's fast, it's fuel efficient, and it carries really big, potent guns. Well, Fisher does some other strange things, though, too. He decides that, you know what we need? We need like super cruisers. We need fast ships to be like scouts. But we need cruisers that are also super powerful. And those super powerful cruisers will be able to destroy the enemy cruisers, and then we can use them for observation. Remember, this is really before air power is available. So scouting is done by cruisers and destroyers primarily. Well, he decides what he's going to do is he's going to build a thing called a battle cruiser. It's going to be the guns of a dreadnought, the speed of a cruiser, and the way to achieve that, of course, is going to be the armor of a cruiser. That's not necessarily a good thing for something that will sort of find its way into the battle line with regular battleships or dreadnoughts. So it really is kind of a miss on his part of designing these things. And the battle cruiser will be seen as really as what it is it's too lightly defended to be used as a ship of the line. But it has every other aspect. It's much faster than a battleship, so it's like a cruiser. But it's not a great design. And really what probably would have been a smarter move was to make more, because these things are expensive, they're huge like a battleship, to make more regular cruisers to do that scouting role, and perhaps start to invest in aircraft, because again, aircraft are now starting to be seen as something that can be used. We'll see that at Jutland. Well, the thing that, because it started back at square one, all these navies of the world, basically all their ships are obsolete. Now they've got to get new ships in order to be a world power. Smaller countries, particularly in South America, decide, you know, it would be really cool if we had a dreadnought. You know, we'd be a player if we had a dreadnought. Well, and they start to buy dreadnoughts. Brazil, Argentina, Chile all decide they want to have a dreadnought. Well, to buy a dreadnought, you don't just buy a dreadnought. You need to have cruisers, you need to have destroyers, you need to have all this other stuff that goes with it. And selling dreadnoughts becomes kind of a big deal. So there are actually salespeople going around to these countries trying to pitch their version of a dreadnought. And for example, Armstrong in Britain, is a major manufacturer of these things and says, you know what, well, we'll go out and sell some dreadnoughts. And the United States is out trying to sell them. Japan is trying to sell them. The French are trying to sell them. So all these salespeople are competing to sell dreadnoughts, which I think is just really funny. So people are buying these things. Well, Brazil has a crash of its rubber market. And so all of a sudden they realize they can't afford their dreadnought, and they decide to sell it to Turkey. And Turkey has already commissioned another dreadnought, so the Turks are going to have two. And the reason the Turks want them is the Ottoman Empire is very much wants to attack Greece. And then the Greece, of course, the Greeks get into a panic. They can't really afford dreadnoughts, so they try to buy old U.S. pre-dreadnoughts, which they actually purchased too, I believe. So now remember, the British fleet is not much larger than the German fleet because they've all had to start at square one. Well, when World War I breaks out, what do the British have? They have all these dreadnoughts that are being built for other people in their shipyards. And they decide, well, you know, if we confiscate those, our Navy will be much larger, much quicker. So indeed, when the war breaks out, they confiscate all these dreadnoughts that are being built for other customers. And they offer compensation. I mean, they're not like, you know, they don't just steal them. But the fact of the matter is this causes a major issue with countries like, for example, Turkey. It gets really PO'd about this. And you can see here, this is the Agincourt, which was going to be a Turkish ship. In front of her is the Aran. That was going to be a Turkish ship. And the Turks are just really furious about this. Well, when the war breaks out also, there is a German battle cruiser and a German regular cruiser that happens to be in the Mediterranean Sea. And they know they don't have the capability to break out of the Mediterranean Sea and get back to Germany with the entire French and British navies in their way. So what do? They sail to Turkey, and they say to the Turks, hey, you know, here's a good deal for you. We are going to sell you this brand new, real nice German battle cruiser and this cruiser, and that way we'll take the place of the ships that you were going to buy from the British. And indeed, the Turks say, yeah, we like this idea. And they buy those two ships. Well, then those two ships have German crews. They put fezzes on. I'm not making that up, okay? They literally put fezzes on to pretend to be Turkish. And they bombard a Russian port, and then Turkey goes into the war on the side of the Germans and the Austrians. And so what that does, of course, now is makes it impossible to resupply Russia through the Black Sea because you can't get there because Turkey's in the way. Well, so did confiscating those battleships, was that a good plan? Probably not. Because now they've got a whole other country in a very strategic location in the war against them. And that will lead, of course, to the very, very destructive and nasty Battle of Gallipoli in 1915 and 1916. So if we look at dreadnoughts as a successor to ships of the line in, from days of wooden ships and iron men from hundreds of years behind, indeed, we would see that they had a relatively long career. But if we look at dreadnoughts as a creation of the Second Industrial Revolution, indeed, they have a very, very short career. In fact, probably only about 34 years. Because in 34 years, they will be superseded by aircraft, torpedoes, and submarines. So people feel, and I would tend to agree, that spending all this money, particularly in the 1930s and early 1940s going into World War II, many more dreadnought battleships were built, including our Alabama. And they really didn't play a significant role. They played a role in World War II, but not a significant role of controlling the seas. So perhaps it would have been a much better idea to have spent the money that was spent on all these battleships, and I could name the Bismarck, the Musashi, the Yamato, there's a ton, that could have been spent more wisely on air power and torpedoes and submarines. So dreadnoughts, very short lifespan. Well, that brings us to the very famous Battle of Jutland. And military historians, they love stuff like this. And one of the phrases they use for a battle of this type is that more ink than blood was shed at this battle because so many books and so much has been written about it. In fact, there's still books today being written about the Battle of Jutland. So it is just an amazingly popular battle. It's people argue about it, who did what, who won, who lost. You can seriously, you go on Amazon, you can probably find 100 books. And it is just amazingly popular, I think, primarily because this is the only time in history where battleship fleets, not individual battleships, but battleship fleets actually fought each other. So the Battle of Jutland has got certainly a big, big following. Well, what leads us to this? Okay, the Germans have a plan for World War I. And what they're going to do is the Germans are here in Wilhelmshaven and the Jade Estuary. And what they do is they put a minefield here. And they expect that the British will do what's known as a close blockade, because the British want to prevent any merchant ships from getting to Germany and resupplying them. And we will talk about this in great detail next semester. But that is their plan. And then the Germans think what's going to happen is that the British will station most of their ships here. So why is this done this way? Because it's virtually impossible to get through the English Channel, so really the only main sea route is here. But the expectation is that the British will close blockade. The British plan is totally different, but the Germans' plan has got some aspects to it that are important to this lecture, and that is the fact that the German ships are built extremely strong. They have very much compartmentalization, so they're very difficult to sink. They're very heavily armored, much more heavily armored than British ships. What do you have to sacrifice to do that? You have to sacrifice gun power size. So the German ships will use significantly smaller guns than the British ships. They're still big guns, don't get me wrong. But there'll be 11 or 12-inch guns on the German ships. The British ships will range from 12, 13, 5, and 15-inch guns, firing much larger shells. So that's their plan. British fool them. What they do is they move their main fleet up here to the Orkney Islands to a place called Scapa Flow. And the reason they do that is they are afraid of being damaged by these minefields and the German ships. So they move up here, and they can still block the North Sea from any German merchant ships. So really, it's the whole point of the way they built the German Navy for this way to defeat the British is actually becomes moot because the British have basically outfoxed them. So we can see that there's a huge problem for the Germans. But the problem for the English by moving their fleet here is now the coast of England is subject to raids from the Germans. So the Germans can quickly sail out, shell some towns in the British Empire, or in Great Britain, and then quickly try to sail back before the British can come and catch them. And that's basically how their plan will work. Well, the total battleship fleets, again, the British have been able to get extra battleships because they've confiscated them. The Germans have 16 dreadnoughts. The British have 28. The British have 9 battle cruisers. The Germans have 5. And even though the British ships are probably slightly inferior as far as defensive capabilities, they still have the Germans cannot possibly face up to this major fleet in a direct fleet engagement. Now, I don't want to make it sound like these are the only ships out here. There's cruisers, there's destroyers, there's torpedo boats. So at the Battle of Jutland, there'll be 151 British ships to 99 German. So this is a huge, huge action, 250 ships total. Well, Scheer is going to be in charge of the German fleet. And what is going on is that the U-boats were waging what's known as unrestricted warfare. And that means that they were torpedoing merchant ships while they were still underwater, which is against international law. Well, they sink the Lusitania, for example, and this causes a furor in the United States. And the last thing the Germans want is for the United States to get involved in this war. So what they do at that point is they agree that they will no longer have unrestricted submarine warfare. Well, Scheer says to himself, well, I've got all these submarines, and now they're not going to be nearly as effective as they would have been, so I'm going to use them in a different manner. I'm going to use those submarines to trap the British fleet. And basically, the idea is they're going to launch a raid on English coast that will draw the British battle fleet and the British battle cruiser fleet out, but I'm going to have my submarines stationed in front of those ports, so when they come out to attack us, I will be able to whittle them down by using my submarines to help destroy some of those battleships. And that is basically the plan for the Battle of Jutland. It doesn't quite work out that way. Because what happens is the Germans are also going to use Zeppelins. And they're going to use the Zeppelins way north of the typical port Wilhelmshaven. And so they will scout for the Germans. And basically what happens is the winds are very high. And another problem is their submarines have been out to sea for a long time because the battle keeps getting delayed for various and sundry reasons. And they're under pressure now to get this battle because the submarines are going to need to be withdrawn. Because submarines at this time can't stay out for months at a time. They're not like World War II. They're much more primitive. So what happens at that point is they decide, instead of making this raid on the British coast, what they're going to do is they're going to send their battle fleet north towards a place called Jutland or the Skagerrak. Well, when they do that, they will not need the Zeppelins because they're so much closer to Germany in that position. Well, the British, in the meantime, they're going to get a little bit ahead here, have this ship, the HMS Engadine. And you can see in the circle that the Engadine is carrying a seaplane. So indeed, this is the first seaplane carrier in history and will actually be used in this battle. What it does is the big box structure there is where they keep the seaplane. They wheel it out, then they hoist it overboard, and at that point it takes off and does its job as a scouting unit, and then when it lands they hoist it back in and it goes back in the box. Well, this ship actually does find the Germans at the Battle of Jutland. But unfortunately, the radio on the plane is good, and it goes to the Engadine, and then the Engadine radios to Beatty, who's in charge of the battlecruiser fleet. And unfortunately, he never receives the message. So even though this is the first time in history that a ship has been sighted by air from another ship, indeed, it doesn't achieve any results for the British at this battle. So, why don't we take a short break and then we will return, because I need to start probably about 1:30, okay? So anyway, back to the Battle of Jutland here. And what we've got going on is that the British have broken the German codes, very similar to World War II. And so they they don't have an exact knowledge of this, but they have a pretty good idea of what's going on. And they know, for example, that there's going to be a fleet engagement, or there's going to be a fleet movement by the Germans. But they also have a misunderstanding, and the best way to describe this is, let's assume that Admiral Scheer has two cell phones. He uses one cell phone when he's in port, and with a phone number, and he uses another one when he's at sea. So that cell phone number will be known as a call sign. And the British make a very critical mistake here, and they ask the wrong question, and they get the wrong answer. And there's a lot of story about this, which we don't have time for, but it is interesting. They ask the question, is Admiral Scheer's call sign in port, in Wilhelmshaven or the Jade Estuary? And indeed, the answer is, yes, it is. The question should have been, where is Admiral Scheer? Because Admiral Scheer changes his call sign when he goes to sea. So he uses his other cell phone. So, needless to say, the British know that the Germans are coming out. They know that. And they know that when they're coming out. But they don't know that all of them are coming out. They only think that Admiral Hipper's battle cruiser force is coming out. So as we can see in this picture, as I talked about in the previous slide, this is the German plan to go to Jutland. And they are going to destroy British merchant ships. And they are going to assume, always a bad word, that the British will not know that until they get there and start destroying merchant ships. Well, that's not how this works out because of their codes being broken. And indeed, Admiral Jellicoe here in the Orkney Islands actually leaves port before the Germans leave port. And also here, the battlecruiser fleet of the British leaves port before the Germans leave port. So, they don't know exactly where the Germans are going, though. And Jellicoe decides, well, it would be a good idea if we went to Jutland or Skagerrak, because that's a kind of a good central location, and that would be probably a good place when we figure out where the Germans are going to be able to do something about it. So what we have going on actually now is we have the German fleet heading to the Skagerrak. We have the British fleet heading to the Skagerrak or Jutland, and indeed we're going to have this huge engagement that neither side is aware the other side is actually well, the British know the Germans are sort of at sea, but they only think part of them are at sea. But what they don't understand is that 50 miles behind Hipper's battlecruiser squadron, there is indeed going to be Scheer's dreadnought squadron right behind it. So both sides are heading to the same location, going to basically blunder into each other. All right, so if we look at the Battle of Jutland, we need to look at it as 5 separate pieces. The first piece will be known as the run to the south. That is where Beatty's and the British battlecruisers will see Hipper with the German battlecruisers, and the Germans think this is great. We're going to lead them onto the guns of Admiral Scheer's fleet that's 50 miles behind coming north. So they all running south. Well, the second part is going to be known as the run to the north. When Beatty sees Admiral Scheer's fleet, he now has to turn around and run north. Now he is leading, he's turned the tables on the British, or on the Germans, and he's leading the entire German fleet into the guns of Admiral Jellicoe's fleet. Then there will be 2 fleet actions. That would be 3 and 4. And then the 5th will be the night action where the Germans basically escape the German or the British fleet. So the first act of this play would be the British have a huge superiority. They have 6 battle cruisers and they have 4 very, very powerful Queen Elizabeth class battleships. The Queen Elizabeth class battleships at this point are the best battleships in the world. They're very fast, they're heavily armored, and they carry that great big giant 15-inch gun that I showed you in the picture of me at the Imperial War Museum. So those 10 ships are going to face only 5 of the German battle cruisers. So they have a huge, huge advantage. But of course, they should be able to do a lot of damage to the Germans before they get back to the safety of Scheer's fleet, but they don't because of numerous problems with command and control. And what are those problems? Strangely enough, even at this time, every ship in the British Navy, a large-size ship, has a radio. But the British do not use their radios for communication between individual ships to guide them, to control individual ships. They don't do that. They don't feel that that is a good idea. So they use flag hoists and they use blinker lights, signal lamps, basically, so that to communicate between ship to ship. Well, this is really no different than what the British did at Trafalgar. So it's just amazing to me that the expectation would be that this would be a good plan. The British always say that the reason they did this was they were afraid that the Germans would intercept their Morse code signals and would be able to, counteract their maneuvers. Under battle, pretty difficult for the Germans to have achieved that. Second of all, you could make simple codes, like you could use the number 2 means turn to port, okay, or turn to starboard would be number 3. And how would the Germans know what that meant? They wouldn't know. So it's a very lame excuse why they chose to do things this way. Scheer and the Germans, on the other hand, are using wireless to control individual ships using very simple codes. And 2 times this will save Scheer's fleet when he encounters Jellicoe in the number 3 and number 4 scenario in this lecture. So there's another problem with this flag hoist thing too, though, is because these ships all burn coal. And coal makes a heck of a lot of smoke. It's also misty and foggy at the day when this battle is taking place. So there's a lot of reasons why this doesn't work out well for the British. The other problem too is this guy, Commander Ralph Seymour. He's Beatty's signal officer. He has made numerous mistakes previously at a battle called Dogger Bank, and he is not relieved of his responsibilities, which is amazing, really. And he makes several major errors in this regard as well. The sad part about Seymour, though, is after the war, he is blamed for the lack of creating a Trafalgar-like victory over the German fleet. And Beatty had always protected him during the war. And after the war, the heat is on so much that Beatty begins to throw him under the bus. And sadly, I believe in 1922 or 1924, Seymour, under all this pressure, actually commits suicide. So it's kind of a sad ending. He's really incompetent. I can't say that he's competent, but it is kind of sad that he kills himself over pressure that was put on him post-war. All right, so how do these flag hoists have problems? First is very simple. Beatty has now seen Hipper, and Hipper is going to start the run to the south, and that is, these red lines are Hipper, this line is Beatty's battle cruisers, and this line are those 4 super battleships of the 5th Battle Squadron. Beatty sees the Germans, sees where they're going south, turns his ships to the south and flag signals to the 5th Battle Squadron that they need to follow him. They don't see the flags. So for a significant amount of time, they continue on a course that is northeast. Because they do that, they fall 10 miles behind and play no part initially in this run to the south because they're out of range.
What speeds are they traveling at here approximately?
Probably about 24 knots. my guess. That is 24, 25 is the maximum speed of the Queen Elizabeth class battleships. So I would say they're putting on all the coal they can to catch up. Okay, next. Beatty's 6 battle cruisers are in range of Hipper's 5 battle cruisers, and he is assigning each ship to fire on a certain German ship. They make a mistake again, and they basically do not fire on the Derfflinger. So the Derfflinger is basically unengaged, so it's might as well, when it's shooting back, it might as well be a target practice because nothing's shooting at it, so they're not under any of this pressure. So again, it's another huge mistake by signaling flag. Third one. Now Beatty has come down to here and he sees Scheer's fleet. He immediately turns around. He orders the 5th Battle Squadron, those 4 super battleships, to turn as well. But Beatty makes a mistake saying that he wants them to turn in succession, which means they get to a point and they turn. The next ship gets that point and turns. The next ship gets that point and turns. Well, the Germans are going to be shooting at that point. So this is a really bad plan. Well, the 5th Battle Squadron actually decides to not follow orders precisely after the first 2 ships do that, and then they turn in succession instead, or turn together rather than turn in succession, starting with the Malaya. But the other problem happens is they're sailing south right into the teeth of Scheer's battle fleet, and once again, Seymour fails to execute the maneuver. So they've been told to turn around and go north. And they've acknowledged that they have been told this. And then Seymour, for some unknown reason, waits several minutes before he gives them the acknowledgement code that indeed that's what they should do, that they should turn at this time. So they continue sailing on and they take a lot of hits that they shouldn't probably have taken. All right, the next major piece of this is this, in the run to the south, is the battle cruiser fight. And what's going on is the Germans are starting to score vastly more hits than the British. And part of that reason is they have a different type of fire. So the British are firing all at one point. And the initial British salvos are long. So they're going over the top of the German ships. Well, remember, there's all this smoke. There's the ships in the way, and they can't really see where their shells are landing. The Germans use a different method. They use a ladder system. And what that means is, let's assume there's 3 turrets on a ship. The first turret is going to fire intentionally short. The second turret is going to fire on target, and the third turret is going to fire long. They can then compute those distances to help them much quicker achieve where their shells should be landing. So their opening salvos are done in that method. And that is a much, much better method. And it's lucky for Beatty because the Lion starts to take the ship that he's on, starts taking a bunch of hits, takes a hit in the turret, and fortunately for him, the turret commander, who is mortally wounded, decides to flood the magazine immediately and receives the Victoria Cross because he does indeed save the ship. Well, 14 minutes into the change, the Von der Tann is beginning to score hits on the Indefatigable. And it hits a forward turret, the magazines start to explode, it hits another turret on the front of the ship, that magazine explodes and the entire ship basically goes down, and you can see her sinking right there because both her magazines have exploded. Well, Queen Mary, I'm going to use Commander von Haas. He's going to be the gunnery officer of the Derfflinger, and he's going to describe the Queen Mary. Queen Mary was having a bad time. Engaged by the Seydlitz as well as Derfflinger, she met her doom at 1626. A vivid red flame shot up from her forepart. Then came an explosion forward, followed by a much heavier explosion amidship. Immediately afterwards, she blew up with a terrific explosion. And that is the picture of her exploding. Well, Beatty has finally used radio to tell Jellicoe what is going on, and Jellicoe sends another group of battle cruisers that is with him under Admiral Hood, and that group is sent down to aid Beatty in his escape to try to draw the Germans up into Jellicoe's clutches. So, they start to score a lot of hits on the German, particularly on the German battlecruiser that is Hippers on his flagship, the Lutzow. And Lutzow takes a lot of punishment and actually will sink later in the battle, but does not explode. But what's going on now is the Derfflinger and the Lutzow start to score a lot of hits on the HMS Invincible. And once again, they hit a turret, and the HMS Invincible blows up. And you can see that in the top picture, and you can see the results of that explosion in the lower picture. The ship is actually blown in half. So why is this going on? Simple enough. The British have used a very bad idea. First of all, their powder that they use, the cordite type that they use for their battleships, is not very resistant to flash fire. The second problem is, unlike the German shells come in canisters. So their explosive powder is in brass canisters. The Germans have a much different breech block. It's more like a rifle bolt than the British type. The British use bags of powder. So you put the shell in the gun, then you put in bags of powder. But the British do not use any containers to bring that bag of powder up from the bowels of the ship on elevators and then into the gun. What they do is they just put loose bags of powder into their elevators and send them up instead of keeping them, like I said, in a canister, which would have been what they should have done. So what has happened is these things all leak a little powder. They're just silk bags. And so what they've done is basically, in a sort of like Hansel and Gretel, they have left a trail of gunpowder breadcrumbs all the way down to their magazines. You have another problem. They decide that they're going to shoot as fast as they can. So they're sending up multiple bags of powder at the same time instead of one at a time, which is what they should be doing. And they start storing these around in the turret. So now the turret is full of bags, silk bags of cordite. And of course, when the Germans land a shell on that turret, what's going to happen? That cordite's going to flare up. It's going to follow its trail of breadcrumbs all the way down to the magazine, and indeed, the British ship is going to explode. And that's exactly what happens to them. How do they know this for sure? In 2012, divers went into the Queen Mary wreck and actually got into one of the turrets that hadn't been destroyed. And when they got into that turret, they found bags of cordite, silk bags, still underwater for 100 years, and knew for sure that indeed the British had been improperly storing this powder, and hence they lose these ships. Well, there's also multiple engagements between lighter ships, particularly British armored cruisers. Armored cruisers should never be anywhere near a battleship. And indeed, they take tremendous punishment and catastrophic losses. Yes, sir?
Wasn't there also a difference in the way that they decided to armor their vessels against plunging fire?
That, I think, is somewhat overrated. The question is, the British ships were less armored than the German ships, indeed. And as far as the deck armor goes, that was the original thought process, was that the battle cruisers were so lightly armored and particularly subject to plunging fire, and so when they're building the battleship Hood, for example, actually battle cruiser Hood, they start to rebuild her right on the stocks and start putting more armor on the deck. Of course, as you know, in World War II, that doesn't really help the Hood much, does it? It blows up because the Bismarck hits it several times and it explodes. So that was the thought, but I don't necessarily, I think really their improper storage of powder is really more of a factor. The Arizona was a battleship, it blew up too, so. When you got that much powder laying around, it's a problem. So anyway, there's numerous catastrophic explosions of ships in these battles. All right, so quickly, Scheer is all of a sudden running north, trying to chase the British battle cruisers. They're looking like everything's going rosy, and then out of the mists, he sees the entire British Grand Fleet under Jellicoe, and he's like, oh man, this isn't good. This is not good at all. Because what has happened is his T has been crossed. So now he's facing the entire gunfire of the British Grand Fleet, 28 dreadnoughts, to his 16 dreadnoughts, and he knows right now, I got to get out of Dodge. So he does something pretty incredible. The Germans have practiced a maneuver called a battle turn. So via using radio, he says, battle turn. And by Morse code, so you know. So by Morse code, they put out battle turn, and so every German ship turns 180 degrees in succession. Instead of going in a line, boom, 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 boom. And all of a sudden the whole German fleet is sailing in the opposite direction. The British are mystified by this. Like, how did that happen? And everything looks good except for one problem. Because now Scheer knows that Jellicoe's at sea. Scheer also knows that now, because of his battle turn, he's sailing in the wrong direction. He's going west. He needs to be going southeast. And this is a problem. So what he decides to do then is he's going to try to sneak around behind the British line, because again, it's kind of foggy out there and people are separated. So he tries to maneuver back in behind the British. Unfortunately, the British are he didn't wait long enough, is the simplest way to put it. And so they are right back in his face. And he decides to do, of course, that battle turn again, and he sends his 4 remaining battle cruisers and all his destroyers to attack Jellicoe's fleet. This is going to cause tremendous damage to his battle cruisers, but it's going to buy him time. And the destroyers all launch torpedoes. Jellicoe is extremely afraid of torpedoes because he doesn't want to lose his fleet, and turns his fleet away. So now both fleets are sailing in the opposite direction. This hasn't solved Scheer's problem of going in the wrong direction still. He's still not going where he needs to be. But he's going to circle much further to get around the British, and indeed that is a successful maneuver. So, Scheer is actually going to escape, but his battle cruisers have been extremely punished by this. And how punished have they been? That is the Seydlitz. You can see she's virtually underwater. Look at the height of that bow. But she does make it home because the German ships are built very, very well. But again, they've been heavily damaged. So Jellicoe decides that what he's going to do at this point, he's going to try to station his ships off the minefields of the Jade estuaries, assuming that and always a bad word, that he's going to be able to catch the Germans in the morning and then destroy the German fleet. The German fleet manages to slip past him. They manage to get into the Jade estuary, including the Seydlitz, which is amazing that ship stayed afloat. And indeed, that will basically be how this battle will end. So there's numerous small battles on the nightfall. There's basically the British light forces engaged the Germans 7 times. Never bother to radio Jellicoe what's going on, because they don't want to break radio silence, which is again a very poor decision. But there are major casualties on both sides. Most significantly, the German pre-dreadnought, the Pommern, is hit by a torpedo and explodes. All right, so we've seen all these giant guns. We've talked about how they're operated, how they are basically, fire control is improved immensely. But still the percentage of hits is extremely low. For example, in the run to the south, the German battle cruisers only make 42 hits on the British. Of course, those are very successful hits. They destroy 2 of the the British battle cruisers. Beatty's ships only score 17 hits on the Germans. Jellicoe's ships are more modernly equipped. They've started to use the dryer table and a bigger version of the rangefinder, and they managed to score 5% hits on the German fleet. The Scheer's ships score 3% hits, and again, they're much lighter hits. But when we look at the Tiger, which is one of Beatty's battlecruisers, she's got 13.5-inch guns. They fire a shell that's anywhere between 1,200 and 1,400 pounds, so it's a very large shell. And she fires 303 shells and scores 3 hits. That's 1%. So you can see that the hit rate is very, very, very low, even with the technology that's improved. The other problem the British have is their shells are very defective. So particularly those 15-inch shells from the Mark I's, from the 4 Queen Elizabeth class dreadnoughts, they have a bad habit of not penetrating the German armor and then exploding inside. What happens instead is their fuses are defective. The minute they hit the side of the German ship, they explode, and then, of course, they don't penetrate because their explosive power is dispersed. So the Germans are very lucky that the fact that the shells of the British are so problematic. Now, we look at this picture. So the HMS Tiger, which is a battle cruiser, to your point with the lighter armor, it is hit 21 times by German shells. It survives. The reason it survives really is the fact that number 12 hits the top of the turret and just blows off its rangefinder. And so it doesn't penetrate into the turret and detonate those powder bags. So you can see, even with the German shells aren't particularly large. Again, the 11-inch shells only weigh like 650 pounds. The 12-inch shells only weigh 850 pounds. So the British shells are much larger and much more potent theoretically. Of course, they've got fuse problems. But still, you see the amount of hits that goes onto this ship, and it survives. So armor certainly plays a huge role in this, but I think basically luck plays a larger role, and proper storage of your powder. Well, the Germans decide that they have made a major victory. They have sunk many more British ships. They have sunk more important British ships. They have destroyed 3 battle cruisers. They have lost 1. So the Kaiser actually declares a national holiday and lets all the German school children off of school that day. But really, it's at best a tactical victory. Because what is going on is that the British still control the North Sea and can blockade Germany. So Germany cannot get the imports it needs to continue the war. All right, so if we look at these sea battles, they're really unlike land battles in the fact that when you're at sea, there's no place to hide. You're just at sea. There's no rivers to hide behind. There's no forest to run into. You're just out there. And fighting in the North Sea, for example, it's really cold. So if you're in the North Sea for any significant amount of time, you will die from hypothermia or exposure. So what happens with these ships? When we look at the Indefatigable, it had a crew of 1,019. It explodes, there's 2 survivors. Queen Mary, 1,275 men, 9 survivors. Invincible, 1,032, 6 survivors. Armored Cruiser Defense, remember those armored cruisers shouldn't be anywhere near a battleship. 903, 0 survivors. Black Prince, 857, 0. Pommern, hit by a torpedo that night, 839, 0 survivors. Total losses for the British, 6,094, the Germans, 2,551. So indeed, this is an incredibly violent affair, and very, very few people survive once a ship is sunk. Well, that brings us to Gallipoli. And indeed, to make this quick, this is the Dardanelles in the Aegean Sea. This is the Sea of Marmara, and that's the Black Sea, with Turkey controlling this piece of water. Indeed, the British and the French cannot support the Russians with supplies. So they are going to have a plan to break into the Black Sea. Now, personally, I think this is a very bad plan for a lot of reasons. For example, what they're going to think they're going to do is they're going to take a bunch of pre-dreadnoughts and they're going to run them down. One thing about the Dardanelles, it's really narrow. It's only about a mile wide at its narrowest point. And they're going to run, supposedly, these pre-dreadnoughts. They got a lot of them laying around that they're not using. And they're going to try to break into the Sea of Marmara, and then they're going to shell Constantinople. Now, why the Turks would decide, just because Constantinople is being shelled by a bunch of old pre-dreadnoughts in the Sea of Marmara and they should surrender, I have no idea. Personally, I think that they wouldn't really, I mean, okay, now you're in the Sea of Marmara, how do you get resupplied? You got to go back out again. So there's really no logical, in my opinion, way that this would have ever worked. Because the Turks would have said, okay, you're shelling the, Constantinople, big deal. But anyway, that's how this is going to go down. Well, so it starts out relatively well for the British and the French. And they are basically able to shell these two outer fortresses. The reason they're able to do that is their guns have longer range than the Turkish and German-made guns that are available. So they are pretty successful destroying those outer forts, but that doesn't get you in here. And what's in there is a bunch of minefields. And everybody knows there's minefields in here. So the British plan is that they're going to sail into the Dardanelles, they're going to destroy the Turkish guns, and what they do then is they're going to use minesweepers to sweep these minefields, and then they're going to go into the Sea of Marmara and do whatever they think they're going to do. Well, the Turks put up a heck of a fight here. Even though they're starting to run out of ammunition, they are still not allowing the British to sweep their minefields. And this goes on for several days. But they do notice one thing. They notice that the British ships keep turning in this one area. And they decide, it might be a really good idea if we put another minefield down. And that's exactly what they do. On March 18th, they send a little ship out. It lays this new minefield. The British aerial reconnaissance completely fails to see it. And the next day, lo and behold, a bunch of British and French ships are sunk on that little minefield. And at that point, what happens? They decide that this isn't a good plan. And what they're going to do 4 days later is they're going to have a land invasion. And the idea of the land invasion is that they will be able to capture the forts from the land side. And so there'll be forts here, of course, but they'll be able to knock these forts out, and from that point on, they will be able to then sail into the Sea of Marmara. So they're going to have a land battle. They're going to land 70,000 troops in this area here. And they're going to be the Australian and New Zealand Corps, the Anzacs, which in Australia and New Zealand they still celebrate Anzac Day to this day. It's the equivalent of our Veterans Day, or you might remember it as Armistice Day. So they will also be supported by the British 29th Division. So on April 25th of 1915, indeed, these landings start. And for example, the Anzacs are landed a mile away from where they're supposed to land. And so now they're basically cut off. They're basically in a cove that is surrounded by cliffs. Well, they can't advance because the terrain is so bad, even though there's almost no Turks there. And of course, the reason there's no Turks there is because nobody in their right mind would land there. So they're stuck. Then the main part of the advance is going to be here in the south at Cape Helles. And some of these beaches are not very well defended. Some of them are undefended. And some of them are what we would consider heavily defended, though they're really not heavily defended by World War II standards. And some of these beaches are going to be a mess. Well, the other problem is the British and the French don't do a very good job of pre-invasion bombardment. So many of the Turkish trenches and guns are left undamaged. Yes, there's some spectacular successes. They do hit an ammo dump, it blows up, and everybody's happy, but a lot of these shells are wasted. They're not used to doing this. This isn't something they practice. So again, they don't have the proper tools and the proper training to do this job. Well, they also mismanage the landing. The British, particularly at Cape Helles, on some of these beaches are completely undefended. They don't rush forward. They stay on the beach and try to consolidate the beachhead. Bad plan. They should have moved forward immediately and tried to take their objectives. Today, of course, we would always say the first thing you would tell a Marine is get off the beach. So they don't do that. And so then they're held up. Of course, the British do get ashore. They have a foothold, but it takes them 2 months to achieve their first day objective. It takes the Anzacs forever to achieve their first day objective because they never achieve it. So this battle goes on until 1916 on this little piece of ground. Of course, they had a huge advantage in personnel to start this battle, but since they don't take their objectives and they mismanage it so badly, they immediately the Turks start to reinforce, and of course this just turns into a bloodbath. It really is like, might as well be the Western Front, trench warfare. Well, why does that happen so much? If we look at this picture, this is a ship called the River Clyde, and please notice that there's a lot of water here. That's all you need to know right now. Notice here, though, that they're landing by just like rowboats. It might as well be the Vikings. There's really no technological difference between this, what they're using to land these troops, and what the Vikings would have used. Indeed, they had the capability. The Evinrude outboard motor is made in 1909, and by 1912, thousands of them have been sold worldwide. So they could have at least put motors on these, but they don't. They literally row them in and tow them in. Well, again, the suppression fire has been bad. They're rowing these boats in, and so when they get close to the shore, all of a sudden, there's only a company, one company of Turkish troops at this particular beach. That's like 200 guys. They pop up, they've got 4 Maxim machine guns, and they begin to mow these British troops down, and indeed they do. So landing with this kind of technology is not capable of achieving your objectives if you don't plan to face modern weapons with modern technology. And again, just like the Battle of the Somme, that's exactly what happens here. The next thing they do, though, is they try to do this. And I mentioned the River Clyde. What they do with the River Clyde is they're going to use the River Clyde as some sort of giant landing craft. And they cut holes in the side of it and create a gangplank down the side of the River Clyde. Problem with the River Clyde, though, it's a 4,000-ton collier. It can't get to the shore. It's going to ground way before it gets to the shore. So then the plan was to bring in 2 barges and have those barges bridge the gap to the shore so the troops could run down those gangplanks, run over the barges, and run onto the beach. They never are able to put those barges in place, and what happens next is, of course, the troops decide to run down those gangplanks right into the water, and of course now they're sitting ducks, and indeed, once again, they become mowed down. Finally, the British say, look, enough is enough. We're going to wait till dark, and then we're going to invade this beach when we might be able to sneak ashore. And that's indeed what they do. The only reason they even are successful as they are is the fact that there are so few Turkish troops defending this beach. If this would have been Omaha, this would have been a joke. So what does this tell us? It tells us that in the Second Industrial Revolution, if defensive weapons are so strong that indeed you cannot use this type of ancient technology, in effect, to storm a beach. And it is not until World War II that the landing craft and the typical better bombardment and all these things that you need to have modern assaults on a defended beachhead become available. And with that, I want to thank you all for coming this semester, and hopefully we'll see you all again next semester.